Okay, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here with today's webinar. First of all, welcome. My name's Derek Lalone. I'm one of the Model Schools coordinators here at the Mohawk Regional Information Center. Probably see me 100 times already doing these intros, but today I get to talk too. But first, before we get started with flipping a lesson for remote learning, I just want to go through, as always, our schedule for the rest of the week, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what's coming up and what you may be interested in signing up for. So tomorrow we have using Google Meet for student check-ins. So really that's going to be focused around not only using Google Meet, but for the specific purpose of checking in with our students. Thursday, we're going to have a quick webinar on setting up Google time slots for scheduling student meetings. So basically what we're going to do is just kind of cover how you can turn your regular Google Calendar into a sign-up calendar. And students have the ability to go in and sign up for time slots within your account, within a Google Calendar that you set up for them. And then Friday, we are doing another top 10 Google Classroom tips to save your sanity with Allison Blackwell. So those are the sessions that we have coming up this week. And as always, if you haven't done so already, say hi in the chat to make sure that you get PD credit for today. And with that, I'm going to jump out of this presentation and we're going to jump into our presentation for today. And while I'm doing that, I will let Brittany introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Gaffney. I'm on Derek's team with the Mohawk Regional Information Center as a tech specialist. I've done a few of these webinars too, so I see a lot of familiar names and some new ones. So I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Thank you, Brittany. All right, I'm just going to turn the banner off really quickly. There we go. All right, so today's session, what we're going to be talking about is flipping a lesson for remote learning. And a lot of today, a lot of our other sessions have been more how-tos on, how to set up a Google Meet, how to do different things in slides. Today's kind of more of the approach of how do I plan around kind of being thrust into this learning environment, and what are some things that I can do to kind of make, my remote learning a little more effective. So we're just going to, we'll talk about some of the tools later on, but really first we're going to talk about kind of the structure around flipping. And we're going to start that with the 4 pillars of flip. So really we're just going to talk about the considerations for your classroom. So when we talk about moving our lessons into kind of a more remote video type environment, some of the things that we need to kind of keep, kind of be aware of as we're moving forward. So.
Right, and I just want to add, this is kind of different than some of the webinars that we've done before in the sense that we're kind of talking about a little bit of a philosophy here, right, and kind of almost like a state of mind. So feel free to use the chat to kind of, reflect openly on how you're feeling about this, and we can kind of work off the chat a little bit to keep this more discussion-esque. This is a little less how-to rather than kind of like a mindset philosophy discussion.
Yep, absolutely. So while we're getting started, we're going to start with the F first, which represents, in this case, a flexible learning environment. So what we mean by that, obviously, is we've all been thrust in this kind of remote learning environment where we're all trying to deliver instruction from home. So we've lost that traditional lecture piece. And what we're finding out is, depending on the district requirements and things like that, not only educators, but students are struggling with trying to stay on schedule with things. I know some districts have tried to have like a set up classroom timepiece, trying to kind of keep some structure in place. And what everybody's kind of finding out is it's increasingly stressful. So when we talk about this flexible learning environment piece, we talk about making the instructional pieces a lot more flexible. So instead of that, sit and get kind of mentality that we have to learn to kind of, move different pieces around. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. And the other piece is, when we kind of move to this remote learning environment, we're allowing our students to really look more at the instruction itself and learn on their own, rather than necessarily relying on a classroom experience or a classroom setting in order for them to get all the information that they need. So, moving forward here, A couple things to kind of harp on here is, once again, don't rely on meeting times. A lot of folks are, setting up times for lectures and doing things like that with Google Meet. And really, when we talk about kind of a flipped learning environment, is that all of your instruction is going to be facilitated through some sort of LMS, whether it's Google Classroom, Schoology, Canvas, you name it. A lot of the instruction should kind of be taking place through that area. And then when you actually meet with your students, it should be times to address the content that they've been learning about on their own through Google Classroom, rather than you necessarily lecturing new content to them as they work. So that's the other kind of point here is, don't lecture for a 40-minute period. Anybody that's ever done a workshop with me that involves video, I always kind of use the analogy of picture, the most boring faculty meeting that you've ever been in, and now picture watching that same faculty meeting on a television set. And that's, kind of the area that we can get into, is that if you're just a talking head on your screen, that brings us over to the snippets part, is that the attention span of not only younger students, but even, older folks like myself, even though I'm not that old, our attention spans have decreased exponentially. So when we're talking about online content specifically, we're looking at between a 4 and 5 minute area of retention. So even if you're posting a video for your students that's, let's say, 20 minutes long, 30 minutes long, something like that, you're guaranteed to have their attention for about 5 minutes of it. And then we kind of don't know what's going to happen next. So when we talk about building snippets, we talk about building little pieces of instruction. So instead of a typical lecture where a student would be sitting in a room for half an hour, we're talking about taking that first idea of a video, creating a 4-minute video on that, posting it in Google Classroom. The second piece of it, posting it there, and then putting it up in Classroom. So it's really kind of taking one lesson that you would do in one big chunk and dissecting it into a lot of smaller parts to make it more digestible for students, and it also kind of gives them a progression to work down as they're going through some of the lessons. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we mean that flexible learning environment, is that we're kind of rethinking the way that we're delivering our instruction in our traditional lectures. So instead of having our students in a room with us and us giving them a lesson, that's more of a check-in to say, hey, I posted all these videos up. What questions you guys have for us? And really kind of create a conversation rather than having them sit in a room and have you lecture, to them via video conference. So moving on here, I just want to make sure my mouse is in the right place. It is, okay. Next up, we're moving into the L of our flip, which is our learning culture. So like I said kind of previously, we're no longer in a teacher-centric setting. Being in this remote setting, it's very hard to be the authority figure at the front of the room when you're doing it, via video conference. That's why we're talking about that culture shift of, creating our learning in those LMSs, communicating with our students through those LMSs, and using the video portion really as kind of a student check-in piece to be able to communicate with our students and find out where they're having any issues in the instruction that's being put out there. The other piece of that is now we're creating an environment where students are learning at their own pace. We're also creating an environment, and I can't stress this enough when we talk about, using video for instruction, is students now have the ability to rewind you as an instructor and watch you over again. So they actually can sit down and they can learn a concept. If they get confused, they can rewind you. They don't have to raise their hand. They don't have to interrupt the flow of the classroom. They can just look at the content that's in front of them, go back and relearn it all over again. So in this case, from the teacher perspective, we're also taking a step back, and instead of being, the figure at the front of the room, we're taking that guide on the side piece. So we're providing them with the instruction, we're providing them with the materials, and now, we're going to rely on our students to talk to us about, some of the issues and some of the things that they're struggling with as they're working through their schoolwork. And once again, just to reiterate, it allows your students, again, that self-paced learning piece, so you can have all your content up there in those small snippets, and the students can go at their own pace. And there's not necessarily, I know we have to have deadlines and things like that, but it's not necessarily they have to watch a 40-minute video tonight or analyze a 40-minute lecture, provide notes. They can kind of break everything down a little bit, which makes the workload seem a lot less. Unfortunately, with that being said, now is a good time to say, with remote learning and flipped classroom and us being kind of plunged into this, realm, is that teachers, have to put in more work on this side. When we talk about remote learning, it's really more about making connections with your students, and it's so much easier to do that when you're standing in the room with them and actually having conversations than it is doing it remotely. So that's one of the other things that, you know, a lot of teachers are finding out, is that, you know, it's a lot more work to kind of keep up with your students and to keep up with everything that's going on, and especially what, you know, it's being required of you by your districts as you're moving forward. So with that, a couple things to harp on with the learning culture piece is LMS utilization. So, you know, leverage your Google Classroom, Schoology, Canvas, whatever you guys decide to use, and try to avoid, you know, that new content within meetings. Try not to lecture through the meetings that you're having with your students. Use that as a time to review and check for concepts of understanding. And again, embrace that guide on the side role as we're kind of, you know, working within this environment. So our I represents intentional content. So to kind of break this down a little bit, and you know, the bullet points here, it says look for ways to maximize instruction practice, to prioritize our content, and to encourage students to work independently. So one of the big things that they talk about here is, you know, teachers now have the opportunity to kind of cut the filler, and I don't want to call it filler by any stretch of the imagination, but this is really a time where we can look at the core content and the core concepts that we need to get across to our students. And if there are things that we can cut out which aren't necessarily pertinent to the retention of knowledge and to the retention of the lesson, you know, we can start to kind of trim that down. So we're only giving the students the absolute base core content that they need to be able to move forward. So that's kind of what we mean by maximizing instruction and practice and prioritizing content, is now we have the opportunity to kind of cut a lot of the extra stuff out, because we are in this remote learning environment, and we do have to try to condense our information into, you know, more clear and concise messaging, especially if we're only doing it in 4 to 5 minute snippets. And then finally, as we've been, you know, talking about, encourage our students to work independently. So always be kind of using that LMS as the catalyst for your students' learning, and using the check-ins to kind of work with your students on where they're struggling. So once again, I kind of jumped ahead and did most of this slide already. But the instruction piece, again, maximize the time you're given, and then trim up your content. So, you know, try to condense it and clean it up as best as you can. And for practice, so instruction should be geared to drive student practice. So really, like I said before, we're giving them the content for them to go in and kind of facilitate their own learning. And we're also talking about discussions. This is a great place for students to kind of ask questions, not only, you know, of you, the instructor, but also of their peers. So if you do have the settings turned on for Google Classrooms where students can talk back and forth to each other, that offers kind of a great place for peer review to take place and additional learning to take place when you're leveraging conversations between students in different classrooms. And this is another big one. Let students show understanding outside of assessment. Now, I know districts have certain standards as far as assessment goes, and everybody's a little bit different. But, you know, we are in a world where assessments are trickier to monitor and handle. So the more you can reduce necessarily putting assessments out there and quizzes and tests and things that push a score, the more it can kind of facilitate that learning and learning in this particular learning environment. So the last RP for professional educator. This is our last part of the flip model. So this is one of those big things that we talked about, where it requires frequent monitoring of student progress. So that's where that, you know, extra work comes in. Whereas, you know, you would sit in a classroom and you'd have all your students there and you can kind of read the room a little bit and know what's going on. You know, now you're thrust into a position where you don't see your students every day. You don't necessarily know if they're struggling because you're not hearing from them. You know, that requires you as an instructor to reach out to your students and say, you know, hey, what's going on? Are you struggling? Are you able to get to the assignments? Do you have the technology that you need? All of those questions that are out there, you know, now we as instructors have to be responsible to reaching out to our students and saying, hey, you know, what do you need? What's going on? Because they aren't in the room so you can read their face. You're not sure if they're doing the work because we're more of a self-guided pace. So it does require kind of that extra step of you actively going out and trying to communicate with your students. Again, that other piece, responsible and be flexible. We have a rule of a 24-hour turnaround. If you receive an email questioning something, try to have a response out there within 24 hours. That's always a good guideline, and a guideline we try to live by. And the other piece, like I said before, we want to be less visible and more interactive with our students. So we want to be, chatting with them, opening up discussions with them, sending little like private messages to them, just checking in, doing little student check-ins and things of that nature. But we don't want to necessarily, again, be that person that's right up on the front of the screen all the time in those video conferences, and students have to look at you as you're like the authority figure. Now you're kind of taking, a step back into a different role. So to kind of wrap up this piece, for the professional educator portion, we're talking about monitoring and interacting. So monitoring, that's just a matter of if you're going to keep an eye on your students more. If you notice that they're not doing their work, they're not discussing, then maybe that's a time where you individually reach out to that student and see what's going on. Another great tool for this is GoGuardian. So if your district does have a GoGuardian in place, it's always good to, if you do set up check-in times or meeting times, just to kind of look out there and see what students are joined in, what they're looking at, and kind of making sure that they're on task. And then when we talk about the interaction piece, I've reiterated it. Check in and interact with your students, much more than you typically would in a typical school day. A school day, you see your students, you say, hey, you do quick check-ins, but now you have to, sit down physically and send those messages out. And another big thing that they talk about with the flip model is personalized feedback. Again, you're trying to build a connection with your students because you're not in the classroom. They don't see your face. They don't necessarily see you emoting all the time. And not only can you not read them as a student, but they have a hard time reading you. Especially if we're just, putting up little quick snippets of stuff. So always be sure to leave as much feedback as possible. And then depending on the LMS that you're using, where possible, leave video feedback. So instead of you typing in a comment, open up your webcam, even though a lot of people hate opening up their webcam, and, leave video feedback where they can, just so you can kind of add that personalized touch with students as you are moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany to talk a little bit about the how, and I will not talk anymore about the why. Brittany, you're still
muted. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
I double-clicked by accident. Yeah, so I noticed Chris was asking some good questions in the chat about some struggles that we're having. So hopefully we can address those quickly too at the end as we move through. But I'm going to be talking about the how. And obviously every room is different. So I just kind of have some blanket ideas that you can obviously tweak and feel free to use. So the first step of how to flip would be to determine your technology and create videos and content. So in the next slide, I have some ideas of how you can make that happen. Hey, Derek, are you sharing your slides? Would you mind? Yep, and then one more.
Sorry, I see a question from Carrie.
Oh.
So how would we check their check-in schedule so we can schedule around the other pieces that they have in place? And really what that amounts to is coordination with other teachers. That would kind of require, what you can do with Google Calendar is anybody can share their schedule. So, if you team teach or anything along those lines, share your check-in calendars with each other. So then that way, even though your calendar will get cluttered, you'll be able to see what everybody else has going on at any given time. So that way you aren't going over top of other teachers. Because yeah, that does and will happen. If it's not coordinated, that you won't know who's doing what check-ins when. Because again, districts don't necessarily give a set schedule for when you're supposed to do check-ins, just that you have to. And that's one of those things that just one of those obstacles that we happen to run into.
And I think I see Kelly and Sarah talking about the students not responding. I think that is something that is happening kind of across the board, unfortunately. And I think that may change as, you know, the directives change. I think at first students, it was kind of more of a review, not a super, you know, you have to be doing this type of thing. But now as we see that schools have extended, I think it will become more of like a mandated type of idea, you know, for the students and parents, and it'll become more official. I think when we started this, the directive wasn't that it was official, that they had to do new work. And obviously every district handled that differently too. So I think we're just kind of in some muddy waters. And I think students right now and parents are taking it as kind of optional, really until the next, you know, chapter begins of, well, this is our reality now. We do have to teach new content. The kids do need to be on, and this is kind of how we can do it. So we're going to show you some tips. If Derek, you can go to the next slide for me.
Sure. And one thing I'll add to that too is I think, you know, like Brittany said, in the beginning there were packets and things for just review, but now what districts have to address is the technology disparities as well.
Right.
So there are students that don't necessarily have the tech that's out there, and now the districts are scrambling to figure out, you know, now that we're in this for a longer haul than what was initially anticipated, we have to figure out how to get that. We have to get the technology into our students' hands. And I think that's, you know, what school districts are definitely struggling with right now too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and it seems like the kids really want to do the work. At least from some of the feedback I've been hearing, right? They're excited to kind of connect online. This is new for them. So a lot of them, they're kind of like, oh my God, this is so cool. I get to video chat with my teacher while she's in her home. Like I can see her dogs and her kids. Like I think that, you know, or his dogs or kids, you know, I think it'll catch on. It's the message that is being sent, you know, it'll change hopefully. So as you're determining your technology, you've probably already decided on, an LMS, right? A learning management system. So I know a lot of using Google Classroom. Some may be using Canvas and Schoology as well. So you probably already have that in place with your school. And the second step is to start creating, you know, your video and content piece. So we've done some videos through the RIC in this series on both Screencastify and Google Meet, and how you can use those tools to leverage your instruction. So those are really helpful when you're creating those instructional pieces for your kids, using those tools and tricks. So after you kind of have your technology, you're starting to build your video content, we move to step 2. And this can kind of also be step 1, right? Being transparent with your students and parents, setting those expectations. It's almost like we have to have a new virtual open house for our parents, right? We have those open houses in September when we give them, you know, here are our rules, here are our expectations, here's our class schedule. Well, all of that has been completely revamped. So I think some of us have to, you know, we have to kind of look at it as a new open house, right? How can we present this new type of learning to our parents? Maybe it's setting up a Google site with that type of information on there. You know, maybe it's sending it through Google Classroom or another type of, you know, Remind or School Messenger, you know, getting that information out one way or another, whether it's a consistent message from your district or you just in your own classroom or team, right? Being transparent. So, some ways to do that is to create kind of an outline like we did, right? Stating your how and your why, right? Why are we doing this? But then also kind of describing how this will look, right? Or how you expect it to look. It's probably going to morph day to day until you get into the groove, but maybe set some goals of how you know, wish or want it to look. And I know a lot of teachers have been doing this with their kids, and especially now, maybe hosting like a live Q&A with parents or even students, right? Opening up a Google Meet and inviting them to join and answering some questions that way that they're having, because this is so new and uncharted territory. Yeah, so I'm just checking the chat. Sorry, I see some things. Yeah, daily check-ins. Yeah. And if we kind of are able to post, that instructional piece, in the forefront, like on a Monday, and the kids kind of have their work for the week, then that allows us to then kind of be free throughout the week to help them with those assignments. And I'll kind of get into that too. So some student accountability ideas that we have to keep your kids accountable as you're going through. So I kind of separated them in a Bloom's-ish way, kind of from simple to more difficult, for A, setting up, and B, the kids just completing. So, some ideas: you could post your instructional video, right, that you made on Screencastify or Google Meet, and just have them post in the class comments a quick reflection, and make kind of like a discussion board about it. Nothing super official, but it kind of opens it up. What's a takeaway that you learned from this? Then you could kick it up a notch to application, where you attach like a Google form or a slide or a doc or something for them to physically do after watching your video, and physically hand into you for you to, eventually maybe take as a grade if that's the route, or really just assess what they got out of that video. And then you could take it even a step further to create and have your kids make their own video to kind of replicate and build upon the instruction you just gave them, and submit that to you as their accountability, right? I watched this, here's my take, watch how I teach my stuffed animals to sound out a word, or, watch how I teach my sister how to graph a point on a coordinate plane, right? So having them create those videos, I think they'll really enjoy it, because they're always using probably one of these to video themselves all the time. So why not, tie that into your classroom? And they can use those same features in Google Meet that you're using to record some of those instructional videos. I know we only have 1 more minute, so I'm going to kind of finish up, but we can, of course, stay on and chat after. And then I think Derek touched on this, right? The idea of keeping it up. So consistency is key. I'll give an example. Every day in school, right, we have a specific subject at a specific time, and the kids know it, right? When I was teaching 5th grade, I had a student who was out sick, and she knew what time I was teaching my reading block because it's just so ingrained in them. And I had all of my resources and things that I used to do my lesson on Google Classroom. So even though she wasn't feeling so great at home, she logged on, and I could see her little image there at the top of our slide presentation to show that she was following along and doing the steps with us, because she knew what time it was. She knew the general schedule. So I think kind of creating that, timeline, and again, it's not going to happen overnight, but that will help with organization. So just kind of keeping it up. And then, of course, if you set a precedent, right, I will post 3 instructional videos and assignments to go along with them. They're due at the end of the week. And maybe you keep that up, or X amount of videos throughout the week. And then maybe in between those days that you're not posting, you're holding office hours to help the kids, just like you would like a one-on-one conference with them if they were right next to you in between. So that way you've kind of front-loaded the work for yourself, right? All of that kind of work on your end is out to the kids, and now you can just focus on really instructing them and lifting their knowledge rather than just constantly posting, assignments. If you front load it in the beginning, then you can really focus on the rest of the kids and their learning throughout the week. I don't want to take any more time because I know we're nearing the end, but we will leave the chat open. And obviously, Derek, anything you have to add, or in the chat, any good ideas or takeaways that you got?
We actually had a question coming from Laura, and I know Chris was addressing it too, but it is, how do we make this applicable to our youngest learners, such as K and 1st graders? And Chris was talking about how his son's in 1st grade, and now all of a sudden, he's been forced into, working in this Google Classroom environment.
Right.
And depending on the level of your learners, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we can do it. And it's one of those things where, maybe an LMS isn't necessarily where your students need to be. The first thing that I thought of when I saw that question is maybe instead of doing an LMS, where students have to log in. If you were to, and if the district allows you to set up, let's say, your own YouTube channel, which I know some of the districts have done, where teachers are putting up their lessons, and instead of using, an LMS, really you can use the comment section within the YouTube videos to communicate with your students. So that way they're only going to one place, to one link, and they still have that communication piece built in as well. And again, I think the other thing to address is also the technology disparities that we have, as far as, do students have devices at home? Most, typically at least one person in the family has a cell phone, but if you're sharing it in an entire household, it's hard to leverage that content as well. So, and like Chris said, kids are pretty adaptable. So I think if they're thrust into the environment and they're given enough guidance, they should be able to pick it up pretty well. But again, it's a matter of, getting that out to them and kind of getting them started with the Google Classroom piece, that they'll kind of start, picking up things.
Oops, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, because I see, talking about the special, the students with special needs and behaviors and ENLs. Yeah, I mean, we struggle to reach those kids when they're in front of us on a daily basis, right? I mean, it's not easy when they're in front of us, and it makes it seemingly almost impossible when they're, miles away and we're only connecting virtually. So I don't want you to think that we're dismissing any of those issues by any means, or struggles, I should say. I think, with K-1-2, regardless of special needs, I think the idea of maybe not having them follow like an instructional video per se, right? You probably won't be focusing on them watching a video and then doing something on paper, but it could be, having them do a project and then their parent just taking a picture of it, or, like a physical activity that they're working on, right? Like PT or OT, having them do that and just taking a screenshot and uploading that as kind of, I don't want to say proof of learning, but, one idea of, it's not always just, here, do this quiz or do this piece of, this worksheet that I turned digital. It can be showing the hands-on learning that they're doing.
So a couple questions that are coming in here. First one, Carrie, how much does it cost to have a YouTube channel? The great part is it doesn't cost a thing. It is free to set up, depending on how your district and your YouTube policy in your district is. If you do have access to YouTube, you can go in and set up an account for yourself. I will say, if you are interested in live streaming, kind of what we're doing right now, there's a 24-hour wait period. Like, you just have to get your account approved in order to be able to do that. But then after that, you'd be able to live stream. So you could, put up a live stream, send it out, put a link in your Google Classroom, and have your students join that way and kind of interact like we are right now. But again, that depends on, your district policies and if they allow you to create a YouTube channel to be able to communicate with your students.
Yeah.
So there's that one. And the next one we have Dave. Here we go. There we go. So youngest learners don't have permissions to access email on a Google account. So email, in this case, most students in most districts don't have access to a Gmail client. And if they do, it's typically at most a 912 kind of setup. So in this case, depending on how the students are accessing content, whether it's through a Chromebook, a tablet, or anything along those lines, as long as they have access to the app. So I know, like with iPad, Android, if you do have the Chromebooks that do allow the app installation, Classroom will, give you notifications, the Google Classroom app, that there's content going on and you have messages waiting and things like that. So it's not necessarily driven by email, but it's just the fact that, we have to work around the fact that our students don't have access to email, and there are notifications built in. Students can also, within their Google Classroom account, set up their own personal notifications. So let's say you post new content in Google Classroom, or whatever the LMS is, they can set up their own personal notifications to say, when a new assignment's posted, shoot me a message or light up my phone, or however they want to set it up. So there are ways around it without necessarily having an email, but it is, it's figuring out how to get that messaging to the people that need to have that messaging, of how the students can set up the permissions. And that's sometimes the challenge, whether the district does it or the instructor does it. And if you're communicating it to parents, or if the district is handling the teacher communicate or the parent communication and things of that nature. So that where it, unfortunately gets a little more political than it does, actually being able to implement things.
Right. Yeah, and I think, we talked about this a lot, the video portion, and the more that you can, even just reading to your kids, right? You probably see a lot of that floating around, like the read alouds that are happening. That for right now is, I hate to say better than nothing, but that is so valuable to the students. It's not nothing, right? To the parents, to the kids, to be able to just, see you reading with them. Maybe, we haven't totally figured out, and we're not totally comfortable with how do we reach, students with special needs and ENLs, completely and the best we can. But for now, I think you just being there with them is a huge step in the right direction, obviously, and a huge feat to overcome in itself.
All right, let me scroll through the comments here.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through too.
Yeah. And another thing I'll put up here, we had it in a slide, but I'm just going to put it up. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email Brittany or myself, or Chris in the chat. He's a good resource as well. If you have any questions, or even anything about policies, setting up your YouTube channels and things of that nature, who to talk to at a district and things like that, we can absolutely help with that.
Yeah. I did want to quickly mention Google has an awesome app for like ENLs, and especially parents too, that maybe the kids, are better at the English language, but the parents, are still learning. Google Translate is a cell phone app that you can download, and it has this newer feature where it uses the camera and on your phone or device, and whatever you point it at, it could be a road sign, or it could be something digital right on the computer, like a website, or for instance, your Google Classroom, right? Or your LMS, and it will translate the screen for them on the image on their cell phone, if that makes sense. So it like overlays where the English words are and will overlay the language that they, want it translated in. And I didn't believe it when I saw that came out. I was like, oh, that's probably really awful and glitchy, but it actually, I tested it. It really works better than you would think. So feel free to pass that along as an ENL suggestion, to your families or to the kids too. That app is really awesome. Yeah, augmented reality, exactly. I was shocked, honestly. I didn't expect it to work as well as it did, so I think that's amazing.
All right, scanning the comments here. So we'll hang out for a few minutes if you guys have any other questions. And if not, I said, we'll stop the feed here shortly. And as always, don't forget to come back and visit us again.
Yeah.
If you, like and subscribe, that always helps us out. And it also gives you notifications anytime that we go live or post any more tutorial videos. Sometimes we won't do webinars. We'll just kind of put content out there as it comes up, from district requests. So, feel free to at least subscribe to our feed so you can get the latest updates from us. And like I said, we will hang out here for a little while. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to fire them away. And I might just pull up our here. I'll mute us as well.